the entire Lazarus Pit mythology explained. Welcome, fellow traveler of Gotham's darkest mythology, to a journey into something older than the city and older than the man who protects it. Tonight we descend beneath the surface of the world to examine the green water that has been burning in sealed underground chambers since before any civilization now standing had learned to write its own name, the Lazarus Pit. The mechanism of resurrection, the specific price of immortality that one man has been paying across centuries without ever fully understanding what the payments were costing him. So settle in, let your body grow heavy, and allow the ancient quiet of underground spaces to carry you gently into rest. The green light is waiting below. There is a particular quality that belongs to the medieval Islamic world at its apex that the centuries since have obscured through the accumulation of subsequent history. A quality of intellectual confidence combined with genuine humility before the complexity of what was not yet known that produced. In the great centers of learning that the Islamic civilization maintained when the European world had largely forgotten how to maintain them. A scientific and philosophical culture whose achievements the history of human knowledge has still not fully absorbed. Baghdad in its golden age, Cairo at the height of the Fatimid Enlightenment, Cordoba under the Umayyads, these were places where the question of what the world was made of and how it worked was being asked with more rigor and more sophistication and more genuine openness to the possibility that the answer would be surprising than anywhere else on earth in the centuries between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the European Renaissance. The scholars who worked in these centers were not compartmentalized in the way that the modern academic world compartmentalizes its disciplines. They were physicians who were also mathematicians, who were also philosophers, who were also alchemists, practitioners of a unified inquiry into the nature of things that had not yet decided that the questions belonged to separate departments. It was into this world that the man who would eventually call himself Ra's al Ghul was born, and the world's specific character is essential to understanding both what he became and why the becoming took the specific form it did. He was educated in the traditions of the great centers, trained in medicine at a level that represented the most advanced medical knowledge available anywhere on Earth in his era, grounded in the alchemical traditions that the Islamic world had inherited from the Greek and Persian sources it had translated and extended, and that represented the most serious available attempt to understand the relationship between matter and transformation. He was, by every available measure, among the most capable people his civilization had produced in his generation, a diagnostician of extraordinary ability, a scholar whose reading in the available literature was comprehensive, a physician whose commitment to his patients reflected the specific form of ethical seriousness that the medical traditions he had trained in demanded. He also had a wife whose illness he could not cure. This is the fact that everything else in the Lazarus Pit mythology ultimately traces back to the specific fulcrum on which the entire edifice of Ra's al Ghul's centuries of extended existence is balanced, and it deserves to be stated with the plainness that it had in the original experience before the mythology had accumulated around it. He was a physician whose wife was dying, and the medicine he had spent his life learning was insufficient to save her, and the gap between what his training had given him and what saving her required was a gap that no available medical tradition could bridge. This is an experience that has belonged to physicians across the entire span of human history. The specific anguish of a healer confronting a patient they cannot help, amplified by every dimension of the personal relationship between them, into something that went beyond ordinary professional inadequacy, into the territory of genuine devastation. The disease that claimed her is not specified in the canon with the precision that would allow modern diagnosis, which is appropriate. The medical vocabulary of the medieval world was not the medical vocabulary of the present, and the translation between them is imperfect in ways that matter for the specific character of what Ra's al Ghul experienced in watching her decline. What is specified across the various accounts that the DC universe has preserved of this foundational story is the quality of the decline. Slow, visible, irreversible by any intervention he could attempt. The specific horror of watching someone you love move toward death along a trajectory whose endpoint is inevitable and whose pace is cruel. He tried everything that his training provided. The training was not sufficient. The disease continued. The cave system that Ra's al Ghul found while searching for what, exactly, the accounts differ. Some suggesting he was seeking medicinal minerals, others suggesting a more specific alchemical search for a substance whose properties the theoretical literature had suggested, without providing a location, was the kind of geological formation that the specific geography of the properties, region he inhabited, produced in abundance, deep, complex, the product of millions of years of limestone dissolution by slightly acidic groundwater, full of chambers and passages whose configurations the surface world gave no indication of. He was not the first person to find caves in that landscape. He was, as far as the available record suggests, the first person to find the specific chamber that contained what he found, and what he found had no analogue in the geological literature he had access to. No entry in the alchemical catalogues that the traditions he had trained in had accumulated. No description that any traveller or scholar had left in any text that survived. The substance was green, which is a simple description of something whose specific quality of greenness the accounts consistently fail to adequately convey. Green in the way of something that produces its own light, rather than simply reflecting the light. Available to it, green in the way of something that is biologically active, rather than chemically inert. Green in the way of standing water that has been doing something for a very long time in a sealed space, without any input from the surface world, whose character reflects not simply its chemical composition, but the accumulated history of its own continuous operation. It was warm when it should not have been warm. It moved when nothing in the sealed chamber should have been moving it. It produced an atmospheric effect in the chamber around it that Ra's al Ghul, trained to observe the relationship between environments and biological states, identified as physiologically significant before he had any theoretical framework for understanding what the significance was. He did not immediately immerse his dying wife. The accounts that compress the Lazarus Pit mythology into its most dramatic elements sometimes omit the period of observation and preliminary study that preceded the decision to use the substance for human immersion. But this period matters for understanding who Ra's al Ghul was at the point of the founding decision. He was a scientist before he was a desperate husband, in the sense that the scientific training he had received was not simply a set of techniques he had acquired, but a set of habits of mind that operated even under conditions of extreme emotional pressure. He observed. He tested the substance on smaller biological subjects before he brought his wife to the chamber. He attempted to develop a theoretical account of what the substance was doing to the subjects he immersed in it, before he allowed the desperation that was his dominant emotional condition to determine his actions. None of this was sufficient to make his eventual decision a fully informed one. The gap between what his preliminary observations could tell him and what immersing a dying human being in the substance would actually produce was too large to bridge through any amount of preliminary study. But it was sufficient to distinguish his use of the pit from simple, desperate impulse, to establish it as the action of someone who had made the best assessment available to him and had decided to proceed on the basis of that assessment. His wife went into the water. What came out was alive. This is the founding miracle of the entire mythology, and it deserves to be stated with the simplicity that belongs to events that are genuinely extraordinary, rather than the elaboration that is sometimes applied to them in the telling. She had been dying, genuinely dying, not in a condition of serious illness from which recovery was possible, but in a condition whose trajectory every medical indicator Ra's al Ghul had available to him had consistently indicated was terminal. The pit restored her. The biological mechanism by which it accomplished this restoration was beyond anything in his theoretical framework, and the accounts suggest that his initial response to watching her emerge from the green water alive was not triumph or relief in their simple forms, but something more complex, the specific state of a scientist whose observations have exceeded the boundaries of their theoretical framework, who is confronting data that their available categories are simply inadequate to process. What he observed in the days following her restoration was the detail that complicated and deepened the founding miracle in ways that the simple fact of the restoration could not contain. She was alive. She was biologically restored to the condition she had been in before the illness had advanced to its terminal stages. But she was not entirely as she had been, not in ways that were immediately and obviously wrong, but in ways that Ra's al Ghul, who had known her with the specific intimacy of a physician and a husband combined, could detect through the accumulation of small observations that any less attentive person might have missed. The restoration was not perfectly precise. Something had been disrupted and not entirely repaired, or something had been added that had not previously been there. In the psychological organization of the person who had emerged from the water, something whose character the accounts describe in terms that reflect the vocabulary of the medieval world, rather than the clinical vocabulary of the particle bass, present, but whose nature the subsequent mythology's treatment of Lazarus' madness makes retrospectively legible. He understood, watching her in the days and weeks following her immersion, that the pit had given him something genuinely extraordinary and had simultaneously given him information about the nature of what it had given him that complicated the gift considerably. The restoration was real. The cost was real. The relationship between the two was not something that could be resolved by further study into a simple net calculation, was not something that could be classified as definitively worth it or definitively not, because the variables on both sides of the calculation were not fully measurable and were not stable across time. The decision that Ra's al Ghul made in the period following his wife's restoration was the decision that made everything else possible and everything else necessary. He chose not to tell anyone. Not the scholars in the centers of learning where he had trained, not the physicians whose collaborative tradition had produced the medical knowledge he had spent his life building on, not the political and religious authorities whose resources might have been used to study and protect and eventually make available to others what he had found. He chose instead to protect the secret, to seal the chamber, and develop a plan for controlling access to what it contained for as long as controlling access would be necessary, which his understanding of human nature told him was likely to mean for as long as the pit existed. The reasoning that produced this decision is the reasoning of a specific kind of intelligence applied to a specific kind of problem, and it is important to engage with it seriously, rather than simply as the rationalization of someone who wanted to hoard power. Ra's al Ghul had been trained in the traditions of scholars who understood what happened to knowledge that was distributed into political environments without adequate protection, who had seen the great libraries burned and the pacing, great scholars persecuted, and the great intellectual projects dismantled by political and religious authorities, who found specific kinds of knowledge threatening to their legitimacy. He had also been trained in the medical tradition's understanding of what desperate people did when confronted with the possibility of preventing death, the lengths to which the human desire to survive and to protect the people one loved was capable of driving behavior that was otherwise constrained by the social and ethical frameworks that ordinary life maintained. A substance that could defeat death, made available to the political and military powers of his medieval world, would not be used to heal the sick. It would be used to produce immortal armies and immortal rulers, and the specific forms of tyranny that immortal power makes possible. He understood this clearly enough to be certain about it, and his certainty was not the certainty of paranoia, but the certainty of someone who had paid close enough attention to the world he lived in to know what it was capable of. The man who sealed the chamber and began to think about how to protect what he had found was not yet Ra's al Ghul. He was still a physician with a secret, a husband whose wife had been restored by something he did not fully understand, a scholar confronting the most significant finding in the history of the intellectual traditions he had devoted his life to, whose response to that finding was to hide it. The transformation from that person into the figure the DC universe knows as the Demon's Head, as the centuries-old guardian of the planet's health, as the most dangerous environmentalist the world has ever produced, that transformation was not accomplished in the days following his wife's restoration. It was accomplished across the subsequent centuries, through the accumulated pressure of a very long life, shaped by the specific knowledge he was protecting and the specific use he eventually made of the thing he had found. He was, at the founding moment, simply a person who had discovered something extraordinary and had decided, for reasons that were not entirely wrong, to keep it to himself. The green water waited in the sealed chamber, patient in the way of things that are not subject to the impatience that mortality produces in the people who are. It had been there before he found it. It would be there after him, unless he made arrangements to ensure that it was not. He began to make arrangements. The mythology was underway. There is a category of phenomenon that the scientific method was not designed to address, not because the scientific method is inadequate as an instrument of inquiry, but because the phenomenon in question refuses to remain still long enough to be measured by any instrument that the method has so far produced. The Lazarus Pit belongs to this category, and understanding why it belongs there is the prerequisite for understanding anything else about it, because the temptation to explain the pit through purely chemical or purely mystical frameworks is a temptation that the available evidence consistently refuses to reward. The people who have approached it as a chemical phenomenon, who have taken samples, run analyses, attempted to identify the specific compounds responsible for the specific biological effects, have produced data that is real and reproducible, and that accounts for a portion of what the pit does, while leaving the most significant portion entirely unexplained. The people who have approached it as a purely supernatural phenomenon, who have situated it within the DC universe's broader mystical architecture and explained its power through the vocabulary of magical energy and dimensional resonance, have produced accounts that accommodate the portions that the chemical analysis cannot reach, while providing no mechanism that bridges back to the physical world where the pit's effects are ultimately expressed. The pit sits between these frameworks, drawing on both and reducible to neither, which is either evidence of its genuine nature or evidence of the current incompleteness of the frameworks being applied to it. And the available data does not permit confident distinction between these two possibilities. The physical properties of the Lazarus Pit, as documented across the DC universe's various accounts, are consistent enough to constitute a reliable description, even where the mechanism underlying the properties remains opaque. The green luminescence that distinguishes the pit from all ordinary bodies of water is the property most immediately apparent to any observer, and the one whose mechanism is most thoroughly resistant to chemical explanation. The specific quality of that luminescence, its consistency, regardless of ambient light conditions, its apparent independence from any chemical reaction that the standard frameworks for bioluminescence or chemiluminescence would predict, the specific wavelength that the accounts consistently describe as sitting at the edge of what the human visual system is designed to process comfortably, is not a property of any known natural substance. Bodies of water that luminesce do so through understood mechanisms. Bioluminescent organisms, specific mineral compounds in specific concentrations, particular chemical reactions whose inputs and outputs can be identified and measured. The pit's luminescence has been subjected to all of these analytical frameworks and has resisted each of them in turn, producing a phenomenon that is observable and measurable in its effects on the visual system, while remaining unaccountable in its mechanism. The temperature properties of the pit are the second consistent physical anomaly across accounts of it. The substance is warm, not dramatically warm, not at the temperature of something whose heat source is obvious and external, but warm in the way of something that maintains a stable temperature through an internal process whose nature is unclear, warm in the way of living tissue, rather than of a heated liquid. This warmth is independent of the ambient temperature of the geological formations in which the pit is found, which, in the deep underground environments where natural pits form, should be considerably cooler than the temperature the pit maintains. Something is producing heat in the pit continuously, and the chemical analyses that have been conducted on pit substance have not identified a reaction whose energetics would account for the heat production observed. The warmth is simply there, as it has apparently always been there, a physical property without an identified physical cause. The movement of the pit's surface, when no external force is applied to it, is the physical property that observers consistently find most difficult to describe, without resorting to vocabulary that the purely physical framework they are attempting to maintain cannot quite accommodate. It moves as if it is breathing, is the description that appears most frequently across accounts, which is a description that is metaphorical in its vocabulary but not, the accounts suggest, metaphorical in its intention. The observers who use this language are not reaching for a literary effect, but for the most accurate description available to them of something that genuinely resembles the rhythmic movement of a living organism's respiratory process. Whether this movement is the expression of a continuous chemical reaction producing small volumes of gas, an effect of geological pressure variations in the formations surrounding the pit, or something that neither of these explanations adequately accounts for, is a question that the available data does not resolve. The chemical composition of the pit, to the extent that it has been partially characterized, includes elements and compounds that the standard geological and chemical frameworks for naturally occurring bodies of water do not predict in the concentrations and configurations in which they appear. The specific compounds are not individually extraordinary. Most of them appear in other natural contexts in different concentrations and different combinations. What is extraordinary is their co-occurrence in the specific configuration that the pit presents, a configuration that the geological processes that produce natural bodies of water do not have any established mechanism for generating. Either the pits formed through some process that the geological science of the DC universe has not adequately characterized, or they were created through intentional action that selected for this specific chemical configuration, or the chemical configuration is itself secondary, a consequence rather than a cause, a byproduct of whatever process is actually responsible for the pit's effects, rather than the mechanism of those effects itself. The biological mechanism by which the pit interacts with damaged and dead tissue is the aspect of its operation that the most extensive documentation has been produced about, partly because it is the aspect with the most immediate practical significance, and partly because it is the aspect that is at least partially tractable by biological rather than strictly chemical analysis. When living tissue is immersed in pit substance, the tissue responds in ways that are consistent across many observations and that represent a dramatic acceleration of the body's own repair mechanisms, rather than the replacement of those mechanisms by something entirely external. Wounds close faster than any known biological process would predict. Infections are cleared through what appears to be a massive temporary augmentation of immune function that operates at speeds incompatible with the normal timescales of immunological response. Chronic degenerative conditions are reversed through processes that imply not simply the cessation of the degenerative mechanism, but the active restoration of whatever the degenerative process has already destroyed. This last is the most significant and the most mechanistically puzzling, because restoration of destroyed tissue requires not simply the cessation of damage, but the positive reconstruction of what was lost, a process that the body's own repair mechanisms are capable of in limited contexts and under specific conditions, but not at the scale and speed that pit immersion appears to produce. When dead tissue is immersed in pit substance, the response is qualitatively different from the response of living tissue and considerably more difficult to characterize within any available biological framework. The biological processes that define death the cessation of cellular respiration, the progressive degradation of cellular structures, the irreversible loss of the organizational information that distinguishes living from dead tissue, are not processes that any known biological mechanism can reverse once they have progressed beyond a certain threshold. The pit reverses them. In subjects where the interval between death and immersion is within a range that the accounts suggest varies, but has an upper limit beyond which the reversal becomes impossible or produces results that are not recognizable as restoration. Within that range, the dead tissue is restored, not simply maintained in a state of arrested degradation, but actively reconstructed to a living state whose organizational complexity is comparable to the organizational complexity of the tissue before death. The mechanism by which this reconstruction occurs is not simply acceleration of the body's own processes, because the body's own processes stop at death and the reconstruction is occurring after they have stopped. Something external to the body's biological processes is providing both the energy and the organizational information necessary to rebuild what death has dismantled. And neither the chemical composition of the pit substance nor the physical properties of the environment it creates provides an obvious source for either. The energy required for cellular reconstruction at the scale that pit resurrection appears to accomplish is considerable, and the source of that energy has not been identified in any analysis of the pit substance itself. The organizational information required to rebuild a dead human nervous system, the specific connectivity of billions of neurons whose specific configuration is the physical substrate of a specific person's specific memories, specific psychological character, is information that should be irreversibly lost in the cellular degradation that death produces, and its apparent preservation through and recovery from pit immersion is the most mechanistically inexplicable aspect of the entire phenomenon. The distinction between naturally occurring pits and artificially constructed ones is a distinction that the mythology has maintained across its various continuities, and that has significant implications for the relative power and reliability of the two types. Natural pits form in specific geological conditions that the available evidence suggests combine particular mineral compositions with particular hydrological conditions and, according to the more mystically oriented accounts, particular relationships to the broader supernatural geography of the DC universe, to ley lines, to nexus points of magical energy, to the specific intersections of dimensional boundaries that the DC universe's cosmological architecture establishes as the points where energy from beyond the physical world is most accessible to phenomena operating within it. These conditions are not common. The number of natural pit sites is limited, and their distribution across the world's geography reflects the specific geological and possibly mystical conditions that produce them, rather than any human planning or intentional selection. Artificial pits have been created through various means across the mythology's history, with varying degrees of success and varying fidelity to the properties of the natural pits they attempt to replicate. The general finding across the accounts of artificial pit creation is that the chemical composition of natural pit substance can be approximated to a degree sufficient to produce some of the pit's biological effects while falling. Short of the full range and power of the natural version, an artificial pit can heal. An artificial pit can, under some circumstances, restore life to a recently dead subject. What an artificial pit appears unable to fully replicate is the most powerful and most reliable version of the natural pit's restorative effect, the reconstruction of subjects who have been dead for extended periods. The complete reversal of severe trauma, the reliable production of the same biological outcome across different subjects under different conditions. The natural pits are more powerful and more consistent. The artificial ones are more accessible and more controllable, which is a trade-off whose practical implications have been explored extensively across the mythology. The Lazarus madness is the pit's most important feature and deserves introduction here before it is examined in its full complexity in the section devoted to it. because understanding what the pit does requires understanding from the beginning that what it does is not simply biological restoration, the psychological disruption that follows immersion, the temporary derangement, the rage that seems to access whatever the person's psychology contains beneath its ordinary social organization, and to express that content without any of the normal constraints is not a side effect of the biological restoration in the way that medication side effects are separable from therapeutic effects. It is integral to the process, present in every case of pit use across every account, varying in its specific expression, but not in its occurrence. Whatever the pit does to the body, it does something simultaneous and inseparable to the mind, and the two things cannot be obtained independently. The gift and the disruption are the same transaction. The rejuvenation effect, the pit's capacity to reverse aging and heal injuries in living subjects who are not being resurrected from death, is the mechanism through which Ra's al Ghul has maintained his extended life. Across the centuries between his medieval discovery and his appearances in Gotham's history, he has not died and been resurrected multiple times, though the mythology contains instances of this as well. He has immersed himself periodically in pit substance as a living subject, using the pit's capacity to reverse cellular aging to maintain a body that would otherwise have aged and died across the centuries of his extended existence. This use of the pit is, from a purely biological standpoint, less dramatic than resurrection but not less significant. It represents the sustained defeat of the ordinary biological process whose endpoint is death, accomplished through repeated intervention rather than through a single dramatic reversal. What the repeated immersion has done to Ra's al Ghul across the centuries is what the Cumulative Lazarus madness section of this account will examine in its full complexity. But the foundation of that examination needs to be established here, that every immersion, whether for rejuvenation or for resurrection, produces the madness, and that the madness, while it resolves in its acute form, does not resolve without remainder. Something accumulates, something that the repeated disruptions of ordinary psychological organization leave behind, something that the recovery from each acute episode of madness does not entirely clear, something that has been building in Ra's al Ghul's psychology across the centuries of his extended life, and that has expressed itself in the specific character of the environmental philosophy he has developed, and the specific willingness to implement that philosophy through mass death that distinguishes him from simply a very old person with strong opinions about ecology. The chemistry of resurrection is inseparable from the psychology of its cost, and the cost compounds. The span of time between Ra's al Ghul's medieval discovery and his appearance in the DC Universe's contemporary Gotham is a span that no ordinary human life can encompass, and that very few narrative traditions have been required to give meaningful content to, because very few narrative traditions have created characters whose lifespans make such content necessary. Ra's al Ghul's centuries are not simply a biographical detail that establishes his age. They are the substance of his character, the accumulated weight of everything he has witnessed and done and lost and chosen across a period of time that exceeds the entire recorded history of most of the civilizations that rose and fell within it. Understanding Ra's al Ghul requires understanding what those centuries actually contained, because the man who arrives in Gotham and identifies Batman as a worthy successor and adversary is not the medieval physician who first discovered the pit. He is what that physician became across hundreds of years of living with what he had found, and the becoming is as important as the finding. The centuries immediately following the discovery were the centuries of radical adjustment, the period in which Ra's al Ghul confronted the experiential reality of extended life in ways that his theoretical understanding of what the pit would provide had not adequately prepared him for. The theoretical understanding of immortality and the lived experience of it are separated by a gap that no amount of anticipatory imagination can bridge, because the specific texture of what it means to persist while everything around you does not, is not accessible to a person who has not yet persisted. He had understood, in the abstract, that he would outlive the people he knew. He had not understood, until he was doing it, what the specific quality of that outliving was, the specific way in which the persistence of his own consciousness across time, while the people who constituted his world were progressively removed from it by death and by the ordinary changes of lives that did not share his extended duration, produced a form of loneliness that had no exact analogue in any human experience he had previously encountered. Ordinary loneliness is the loneliness of a person who lacks the company they need in a world that contains the possibility of that company being restored. The loneliness of Ra's al Ghul's early centuries was the loneliness of a person who understood that the company he had lost would never be restored in the forms in which it had existed, that the specific people who had constituted his world were gone in ways that were permanent, regardless of the pit's capacity to restore life. Because the pit could not restore them to him, could only restore someone else to themselves if he chose to use it for that purpose, which was a different thing entirely from having back what he had lost. His wife did not live forever. This is a detail that the mythology handles with the specific brevity that belongs to information that is very important, but that the characters who carry it have learned not to dwell on. And the brevity itself communicates something about how Ra's al Ghul has processed this information across the centuries since it became true. The pit restored her from her illness. It did not make her immune to every other way that a medieval woman could die, and the medieval world contained many such ways, and one of them eventually claimed her in a manner and at a time that the pit could not address, because Ra's al Ghul was not present with access to the pit at the relevant moment. He buried her, he continued. The person who continued was already different from the person who had found the cave, and the person he became in the centuries following her second death was progressively further from that original person in ways that the accumulated pressure of extended life made inevitable, and that the Lazarus madness made more comprehensive than ordinary grief would have produced. The formation of the League of Assassins or the League of Shadows, the name varying across continuities in ways that reflect the organization's own internal relationship with the different aspects of its mission, was not accomplished in a single organizational moment, but was developed across a period of decades in which Ra's al Ghul refined his understanding of what controlling the pit's secret required and what organizational form that control needed to take. The League's structure reflected the specific intelligence of someone who had been trained in the traditions of medieval secret societies and who understood what those traditions had accomplished and why they had eventually failed, who understood that secrecy without capability was insufficient, that capability without ideology was unstable, that ideology without organizational structure dissolved when the individuals who embodied it died. He designed the League to address each of these failure modes simultaneously, building an organization that combined the operational capabilities of the most effective military and intelligence institutions of whatever era it was operating in, with an ideological framework that gave its members reasons to be loyal, that were not dependent on Ra's al Ghul's personal presence in every operational context, and a structure that could continue functioning through the inevitable deaths of individual members without losing the coherence that gave the organization its character. The specific ideology that Ra's al Ghul embedded in the League's founding culture was not yet the fully developed environmental philosophy that the DC universe knows him for. It was, in its early form, something simpler and in some ways more defensible, a commitment to the preservation of the natural order against the specific forms of disruption that human civilization imposed on it, a philosophical position that the centuries of pre-industrial human civilization that he was observing would not have made obviously extreme. The natural world in Ra's al Ghul's early centuries of extended observation was a natural world that the scale and technology of human civilization had not yet begun to transform at the rate and in the ways that would eventually make his position seem less like ecological philosophy and more like misanthropy with a theoretical framework. He began as a conservationist in the most genuine sense of the term and became something else across the centuries. And the trajectory of that becoming is inseparable from the cumulative effects of the Lazarus madness on the empathic architecture that had made the conservationists' concern for the natural world a form of love rather than simply a position. The historical events that Ra's al Ghul witnessed within his extended observation, the Crusades, and their consequences for the cultures and landscapes of the regions they moved through, the Mongol expansion and its specific relationship with the ecological systems of Central Asia, the rise and fall of the great Islamic empires, and the specific forms of environmental transformation that the expansion and contraction of large political units imposed on the territories they controlled, were events that he observed from a perspective that no ordinary historical participant could share. He was not simply a witness to history in the sense of someone who happens to be present at significant events. He was a longitudinal observer of a kind that human civilization had never produced before, someone whose continuous presence across multiple centuries gave him a relationship with the patterns of historical change that even the most sophisticated contemporary historians could not replicate, because historians read about the past, while Ra's al Ghul had lived through it. What this longitudinal observation produced in him, across the centuries in which the environmental philosophy was developing from its early conservationist form toward its eventual radical conclusion, was a perspective on the relationship between human civilization and the natural world that was genuinely informed by evidence that no one else had access to in the form of direct experience. He had watched civilizations expand and exhaust the ecological systems that supported them. He had watched the specific ways in which the scale of human settlement transformed the biological diversity of the landscapes it occupied. He had watched these patterns repeat across cultures and geographies and centuries, with a consistency that, to someone observing the full temporal sweep of the repetition, looked not like the contingent failures of specific civilizations, but like the characteristic behavior of a species whose relationship with its environment was structured by something more fundamental than the specific choices of specific societies. He drew the conclusion that the pattern was too consistent to be addressed through the improvement of specific societies' environmental practices, and the conclusion was not, as a purely empirical matter, entirely wrong. The tragedy of Ra's al Ghul is not that he was simply incorrect in what he observed. It is that what the Lazarus madness progressively did to his capacity for the kind of specific empathy that makes individual human lives feel real and valuable caused him to move from accurate observation to catastrophic conclusion without the moral check that adequate empathic function would have provided. Talia entered his extended existence as a complication that his centuries of cultivated emotional management had not prepared him for. Not simply because she was his daughter, but because she was his daughter, whose mother he had loved in the specific way of someone who had not yet fully learned the emotional armoring that extended life eventually imposes, and whose existence, therefore, connected him to a vulnerability that his subsequent centuries had been progressively sealing off. She was the person who made Ra's al Ghul human in the most inconvenient possible sense, who kept accessible in him the capacity for the kind of specific, particular attachment to an individual person that his environmental philosophy, in its fully developed form, required him to subordinate to the welfare of the species and the planet as abstractions. He loved her in a way that his philosophy could not fully accommodate, and that his centuries of extended life had not equipped him to simply suppress. And the tension between the love and the philosophy was one of the organizing tensions of his extended existence's final centuries. The additional pit sites that Ra's al Ghul located and secured across his centuries of operation were found through a combination of the geological knowledge he had developed in his study of the original pit, the intelligence network that the League provided, and whatever mystical sensitivity the accumulated centuries of pit exposure had developed in him for the specific quality of environments that contained or were proximate to pit formations. The geographic distribution of the pits he controlled across multiple continents. In geological formations, whose surface expressions gave no indication of what the underground chambers beneath them contained, reflected the genuinely global scope of his extended operation and the specific intelligence of someone who understood that controlling a single pit site created a vulnerability that controlling multiple sites distributed across different geographies and different political environments could address. Each additional pit site was both a resource and an obligation, requiring the League's protective attention and the specific operational infrastructure that maintaining a secret of that magnitude in a constantly changing political landscape demanded. The network of pits was, by the time Ra's al Ghul's history intersected with Batman's, as much a logistical challenge as a strategic asset. The philosophy of death that Ra's al Ghul developed across his centuries of controlling the ability to defeat it was the most philosophically interesting product of his extended life, and the one that his relationship with Batman most directly engaged. He had thought about death in the way that only someone who had defeated it for themselves, while continuing to administer it to others, could think about it from a position of personal immunity combined with operational familiarity, which is a perspective that the philosophical traditions available to him had not anticipated, and that he had been required to develop largely without the guidance of any existing framework. His conclusion, arrived at across centuries of reflection and progressively shaped by the Lazarus madness in ways he could not fully perceive, was that death was necessary in ways that went beyond the simple ecological observation that mortality was necessary for the cycling of biological materials. He believed, and had believed long enough, that the belief had the quality of bedrock rather than conclusion, that mortality was necessary for meaning that the value of human lives, their capacity to generate the commitments and the passions and the attachments that made them worth living, was inseparable from their finite duration. And yet he had defeated his own mortality. And yet he was prepared to administer death to others at a scale that the history of human conflict had rarely achieved. The contradiction between these positions was one that he had not resolved, and the available evidence suggests that the Lazarus madness had progressively eroded the part of his psychological architecture that would have been most troubled by the irresolution. He was, when Batman found him, a figure of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary danger, shaped by centuries of experience and centuries of pit exposure into something that was genuinely difficult to categorize within the conventional frameworks of villainy, not simply a person who had chosen wrong over right, but a person whose extended life and its specific psychological consequences had produced a worldview that was at once genuinely informed by real observation and genuinely distorted by the accumulated effects of something that had been shaping his mind from the inside for a very long time. The medieval physician was still in there, somewhere behind the centuries. Whether what the pit had accumulated in front of him was enhancement or replacement was the question that Batman would spend the most sustained and the most intellectually serious portion of his career attempting to answer. The encounter between Batman and Ra's al Ghul is, at its foundational level, an encounter between two figures who share a quality of absolute commitment that distinguishes them from essentially everyone else in the DC universe's moral landscape, a quality of having organized every dimension of their existence around a single purpose with a completeness that admits no meaningful reservation and no genuine alternative priority. Batman is committed to justice for Gotham's victims, with a totality that has consumed every relationship and every personal pleasure that an ordinary life would have maintained alongside its commitments. Ra's al Ghul is committed to the health of the planet, with a totality that has consumed every individual attachment and every specific empathy that an ordinary life would have maintained as the experiential grounding of whatever philosophy it developed. Both of them have paid a price for this totality that most people would recognize as catastrophic, and that both of them have chosen to regard as simply the cost of seriousness. This shared quality of absolute commitment is the basis of Ra's al Ghul's genuine respect for Batman, the recognition of a fellow traveler in the specific territory of total dedication that Ra's al Ghul's centuries of extended life have made almost completely empty of other inhabitants, and it is also the basis of their irreconcilability, because the specific purposes they are totally committed to are not simply different in the way that different priorities are different, but incompatible in the way that opposite conclusions drawn from the same evidence are incompatible. Ra's al Ghul identified Batman as a potential successor before he identified him as an adversary, which is the detail that most clearly illuminates how Ra's al Ghul understood the encounter at its beginning. The identification was not simply the recognition of physical and tactical capability, though Batman's physical and tactical capability is extraordinary by any relevant standard. It was the recognition of the specific quality of commitment that Ra's al Ghul had not encountered in anyone in a very long time. The recognition of someone who had organized themselves around a purpose with the same totality that Ra's al Ghul's centuries of extended life had given him the time and the motivation to develop. The offer of succession was therefore not condescending or strategic in its primary motivation. It was, in its own terms, genuine, the most significant gesture that Ra's al Ghul's extended isolation from genuine equals had made him capable of. The offer to share both the purpose and the immortality that the purpose required with someone he had assessed as capable of both. Batman's refusal was not the simple heroic rejection of villainy that a less nuanced account of their relationship might present it as. It was a philosophically considered position based on a specific understanding of what accepting the pit would do to the person who accepted it, an understanding that Batman had developed through his own study of pit chemistry and Lazarus madness, psychology, and through his direct observation of what the centuries of pit use had produced in Ra's al Ghul himself. Batman understood, with the clarity that his detective's intelligence applied to the specific evidence of Ra's al Ghul's character and history, that the Lazarus madness was not simply a side effect that could be managed through sufficient psychological discipline. It was a cumulative process, and Ra's al Ghul was its most extensive demonstration. And what it had cumulatively produced in Ra's al Ghul was a mind that retained all of its intellectual capability while having progressively lost the specific form of moral grounding that made intellectual capability something other than a sophisticated instrument for rationalizing whatever the madness had left behind as the dominant motivational structure. Batman refused the pit because he understood, better perhaps than Ra's al Ghul himself, what the pit would eventually make of anyone who used it long enough. The title that Ra's al Ghul extended to Batman al Ghul, the detective, was not simply an honorific. It was a communication in the compressed vocabulary of someone who had learned across centuries to be precise about what he chose to say, of the specific nature of the respect he was extending. Ra's al Ghul had encountered warriors and scholars and politicians and religious figures and criminal masterminds across his centuries of extended life, and he had found most of them, in their various domains of excellence, comprehensible and therefore not entirely interesting. Batman was interesting because he was genuinely difficult to comprehend from within the frameworks that Ra's al Ghul had spent centuries developing for comprehending human beings, because his specific combination of capabilities and commitments and refusals did not fit the categories that centuries of observation had established, because he represented, in Ra's al Ghul's experience, a genuinely novel configuration of human potential that the centuries had not previously produced in a form this clear or this sustained. The detective, the one who sees. What Batman saw in Ra's al Ghul was the Lazarus madness beneath the philosophy, the cumulative disruption beneath the centuries of intellectual refinement, the gap between what Ra's al Ghul understood himself to be a clear-eyed observer of humanity's catastrophic relationship with the natural world, drawing rational conclusions from genuine evidence, and what the available evidence of his behavior and his specific emotional responses to challenged positions suggested he actually was a person whose capacity for the kind of morally grounding specific empathy that should complicate any conclusion requiring mass death had been progressively eroded by centuries of something that had been working on his mind from the inside. This assessment was not something Batman articulated to Ra's al Ghul directly, because articulating it would have served no purpose that the articulation could have achieved. Ra's al Ghul did not accept the assessment, had the intellectual resources to counter it with arguments whose sophistication exceeded what any direct confrontation could resolve, and had in any case spent enough time with the madness that its effects were no longer fully visible to him from the inside. But the assessment shaped Batman's approach to their conflict in every encounter. The understanding that he was not simply fighting someone who had made wrong choices, but someone who had been progressively shaped by a process that had made certain choices feel not only right, but inevitable. Talia al Ghul's position in the dynamic between her father and Batman was the position of someone who understood both of them better than they understood each other, who loved one and was devoted to the other in ways that were not entirely compatible, and that she spent her existence navigating with the specific intelligence and the specific pain of someone who has been placed by birth and by choice at the intersection of two irreconcilable worlds. She served as the most intimate expression of the Lazarus Pit mythology's central tension between the ancient and the present, between the immortal's long view and the mortal's specific investment in specific people, between the philosophy that required the subordination of individuals to the welfare of the abstract species and the love that required the elevation of specific individuals above abstract considerations of any kind. She was, in the mythology's deepest register, what happened when the Pit's world and Batman's world produced a person together, and what happened was someone who could not be fully at home in either. The moral question that Batman's existence posed for Ra's al Ghul across their recurring encounters was the question that the centuries of accumulated certainty had made it most difficult for Ra's al Ghul to genuinely engage, with the question of whether the specific people whose deaths his environmental philosophy required were real in the way that made their deaths something other than an acceptable cost. Batman's entire existence was organized around the reality of specific people, around the specific weight of specific lives that should not have ended in the specific ways they had ended, around the moral significance of the individual that Ra's al Ghul's philosophy, in its fully developed form, could not accommodate without dissolving. The detective and the immortal argued this question across decades of encounter without resolving it, because the question was not resolvable through the kind of evidence and argument that their encounters could produce, and because both of them were too absolutely committed to their respective positions to follow the argument wherever it might lead. But the argument was genuine, which was itself something that Ra's al Ghul's extended isolation from genuine intellectual opposition had made rare enough to be significant. The detective was worth arguing with. That, for Ra's al Ghul, was the highest available compliment, and the green water waited beneath them both, patient as it had always been, indifferent to who was right. There is a quality that the acute phase of Lazarus madness possesses that distinguishes it from every other form of psychological crisis that the DC universe has documented. A quality that the accounts of people who have witnessed it consistently identify and consistently struggle to articulate within the vocabulary available to them. It is not simply rage, though rage is present and present at an intensity that exceeds ordinary rage in the way that the pit's luminescence exceeds ordinary light, not different in kind from what the word names, but different in magnitude in ways that make the familiar term feel inadequate to what it is being asked to describe. It is not simply confusion, though the perceptual distortion that accompanies the acute phase produces a relationship with reality that a clinical observer would characterize as profoundly disorganized. It is not simply the temporary loss of the social and emotional constraints that normally organize behavior, though the constraints are certainly lost, and the behavior that follows their loss is certainly organized around impulses that the ordinary social self would not have permitted expression. What the witnesses describe when they reach for accuracy rather than category is something that feels like disclosure, like a compulsory revelation of whatever the person actually is, beneath the layers of self-management and social presentation and conscious ethical commitment that constitute the ordinary self, a forced opening of the psychological architecture to its own deepest contents, under conditions that provide no capacity to choose which contents are revealed or how they are expressed. This quality of disclosure is the most important thing about Lazarus madness and the most philosophically significant, because it means that the specific character of any individual's acute madness is not random. It is not the generic presentation of neurological disruption that looks the same in every subject regardless of who they were before the immersion. It is the specific presentation of a specific person's specific psychological contents under conditions where the ordinary mechanisms that filter and organize and constrain the expression of those contents have been temporarily disabled. The person who emerges from the pit in the acute phase of the madness is not a different person from the person who entered it. They are the same person with the filters removed, which is both less and more alarming than being a different person, depending on what the filters were concealing. For someone whose ordinary psychology contains, beneath its social management, primarily grief and loss, and the specific forms of rage that profound injustice produces in people who have been shaped by profound injustice, the madness expresses those things. For someone whose ordinary psychology contains, beneath its social management, the accumulated weight of centuries of pit exposure and the specific empathic erosion that repeated madness cycles eventually produce, the madness expresses that the pit does not create what it reveals. It simply removes, temporarily, the capacity to keep it hidden. The neurological mechanism of Lazarus madness, to the extent that the DC Universe's scientific traditions have been able to characterize it, involves a disruption of the regulatory systems of the prefrontal cortex, the neural structures that are responsible for impulse control, for the modulation of emotional responses, for the maintenance of the social and ethical commitments that constitute the ordinary self's relationship with other people and with its own behavior. These structures are not destroyed by pit immersion. They are disrupted, temporarily overwhelmed by whatever the pit substance does to the neurological environment in which they operate, rendered temporarily ineffective at the regulatory functions that constitute their primary contribution to ordinary psychological organization. The disruption resolves across a period of hours to days as the neurological environment normalizes following immersion, and when it resolves, the regulatory structures resume their functions. But the resumption is not perfectly identical to the pre-immersion state, because whatever the pit substance has done to the neurological environment has left traces that the recovery process does not entirely clear. The acute phase begins at the moment of emergence from the pit and peaks within a period of minutes, producing a state of extreme agitation and perceptual distortion that the witnesses of multiple pit restorations have described with a consistent vocabulary of overwhelming intensity. The person who has just emerged is not capable of the ordinary forms of social engagement, is not capable of recognizing the context they are in or the people around them in the way that would normally organize their response to both, is not capable of connecting their present experience to the biographical history that would normally provide a framework for understanding what is happening to them. They are present to their immediate sensory environment with an intensity that exceeds ordinary sensory experience, and that is not organized by the interpretive frameworks that ordinary sensory experience operates through, because those frameworks are among the things that the pit's disruption has temporarily disabled. The result is a form of experience that the accounts of those who have partially recovered from the acute phase and retained some memory of it describe as simultaneously overwhelming and strangely clear, overwhelming in the quantity and intensity of sensory and emotional information, clear in the absence of the filtering and the suppression and the deferral that ordinarily mediates between experience and expression. The recovery curve from acute Lazarus madness follows a pattern that has been documented across enough cases to constitute a reliable general description, though the specific timeline varies considerably across individuals and across circumstances of immersion. The extreme agitation of the immediate post-emergence phase resolves first, as the most acute neurological disruption begins to stabilize, and the regulatory structures begin to reassert some degree of influence over the most extreme behavioral expressions of the state. This is followed by a period of confused but somewhat more organized engagement with the environment. The person begins to recognize context and people in a basic way, begins to connect present experience to biographical memory in at least a partial fashion, begins to be capable of the kinds of social interaction that the acute phase had entirely precluded. The perceptual distortion resolves more slowly than the behavioral agitation, and the emotional intensity more slowly still, so that the recovering person is in a state for some period of time in which they are behaviorally more organized than they feel capable of appearing relatively normal to an outside observer, while internally still experiencing something considerably more turbulent than their external presentation reflects. The question of whether full recovery from the acute phase is truly full, whether the person who has recovered from the Lazarus madness is identical in every psychologically relevant respect to the person who entered the pit, is a question that the mythology has consistently answered in the negative, while leaving the specific nature of the difference open to interpretation. Something changes. The accounts of people who know the recovered individuals well, who have the specific intimacy and attention that allows the detection of subtle differences that more casual acquaintance would miss, consistently note some quality of the post-recovery person that is not entirely continuous with the pre-immersion person, some adjustment in the psychological architecture whose nature is difficult to characterize precisely, but whose presence is consistently detectable to the right kind of attention. The adjustment is not dramatic in cases of single or infrequent use. It is the kind of thing that the people who notice it debate with themselves about whether they are really noticing it, or simply importing their knowledge of what the person has been through into a perception of difference that may not be empirically grounded. The debate is unresolvable, which is itself informative. If the change were simply absent, the debate would not occur. In cases of repeated use, the cumulative effect becomes progressively less subtle and more clearly legible in the person's behavior and their expressed worldview. Ra's al Ghul is the mythology's most extensively documented case of repeated pit use, and his psychology is the mythology's most complete demonstration of what the cumulative Lazarus madness eventually produces in a person who has been using the pit across centuries of extended life. The specific character of what the cumulative madness has done to his psychology is not simple and is not adequately described by any single clinical category, but its most significant dimension is the one that the mythology's recurring engagement with his environmental philosophy and his willingness to implement that philosophy through mass death consistently illuminates. The cumulative Lazarus madness has eroded his capacity for the kind of specific, particular, irreducible empathy with individual human beings that makes individual human deaths feel like something other than an acceptable cost in service of a sufficiently significant objective. This erosion is not total. Ra's al Ghul is capable of specific attachment, most clearly demonstrated by his relationship with Talia and by the genuine respect he extends to Batman. And the capability for specific attachment is the most robust evidence available that the person the medieval physician was has not been entirely replaced by what the centuries and the pit have produced. But the erosion is extensive, and its extent is precisely calibrated to make the specific conclusion that his environmental philosophy requires that the reduction of human population by a catastrophic margin is a necessary and defensible response to humanity's relationship with the natural world feel not like the crossing of a moral threshold, but like the obvious conclusion of a clear-eyed analysis. The person who perceives this most clearly, who has made the most sustained and the most accurate assessment of what the cumulative madness has done to Ra's al Ghul's psychology, is Batman. The detective's capacity for sustained observation, combined with his specific interest in the relationship between psychological architecture and behavioral pattern, has produced, across the years of their recurring encounters, an understanding of Ra's al Ghul that Ra's al Ghul himself does not fully possess, because the understanding of what something is doing to your mind from the inside is always less complete than the understanding available to someone observing from the outside with sufficient attention and sufficient knowledge of what they are looking for. Batman understands that the philosophy is real, that Ra's al Ghul has genuinely observed what he claims to have observed, that the evidence he cites for his environmental conclusions is genuine evidence that supports genuine conclusions. What Batman also understands, and what Ra's al Ghul cannot fully see, is that the specific version of those conclusions that requires mass death as its implementation is not the only conclusion the evidence supports. That a mind with its full empathic architecture intact, confronting the same evidence, would find the mass death conclusion not obvious but monstrous, and would seek a different implementation with the same urgency that Ra's al Ghul applies to the mass death option. The madness has not given Ra's al Ghul a wrong conclusion from right evidence. It has removed the psychological constraint that would have prevented the wrong conclusion from feeling like the right one. This is the Lazarus madness's most significant long-term effect, and its most philosophically important contribution to the mythology, not the temporary derangement of the acute phase, which resolves and leaves behind a person who appears largely recovered, but the cumulative erosion of the specific psychological capacities that make certain conclusions unavailable to a morally intact mind. The pit gives life and takes from the living person the very faculty whose full operation makes life worth giving the capacity to feel, with appropriate specificity and appropriate weight, the value of other individual lives. It is the mythology's most elegant and most disturbing irony, and it is expressed most completely in Ra's al Ghul, the man who has used the pit more than anyone, and who has therefore paid this cost more completely than anyone, and who is therefore the least equipped of anyone to perceive the specific nature of what he has lost. There are moments in the history of the DC universe that function as more than narrative events that carry in their specific combination of elements a weight of meaning that the narrative framework surrounding them does not fully contain, that compress into a single dramatic occurrence the central tensions and the deepest implications of the mythological structure they are part of. The death of Jason Todd is one of these moments. The resurrection of Jason Todd is another. Between them, they constitute the most personal and the most humanly immediate expression of the Lazarus Pit mythology, the moment when the ancient mechanism of the pit intersected not with the centuries-long project of an immortal's extended existence, but with the specific tragedy of a specific child who had been given something extraordinary and had it taken away in the most deliberately cruel manner available to the person who took it. Jason Todd's death in the warehouse in Ethiopia at the hands of the Joker, accomplished with a crowbar, accomplished with the specific deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and to whom, and what the consequences would be for the person they most wanted to damage, was not simply a murder. It was a communication, the most direct and the most permanent statement that the Joker had yet made in the ongoing philosophical argument he conducted with Batman through criminal action. The argument had always been about whether order was sustainable, whether justice was meaningful, whether the universe had any investment in the survival of the things that Batman dedicated himself to protecting. The death of Jason Todd was the Joker's most carefully constructed evidence for the negative, the demonstration that the things most worth protecting were precisely the things most vulnerable to destruction, that the investment in protecting them was itself the mechanism by which their destruction could be made most devastating. What happened to Jason before his death is essential to understanding what the pit did to him after it, and the mythology does not permit the resurrection to be understood in isolation from the torture that preceded it. The months of captivity that the Joker's careful orchestration of Jason's capture produced were not simply physical suffering, though the physical suffering was severe and sustained and deliberately calibrated to maximize its damage. They were, more significantly, a sustained psychological operation whose specific objective was the deconstruction of everything that had made Jason Todd who he was, the systematic dismantling of the identity and the commitments and the relationships and the finer beliefs that had constituted the specific person Batman had taken in and trained and made his partner. The Joker was not simply hurting Jason. He was using Jason's specific psychological architecture as a laboratory for an experiment in the limits of human psychological resilience, applying the pressures that his exceptional understanding of psychological vulnerability identified as most likely to produce the specific outcome he was pursuing, not simply Jason's death, but Jason's transformation before death into a vehicle for delivering a specific message about the futility of Batman's mission and the ultimate inadequacy of everything Batman had tried to give him. The specific content of the Joker's psychological assault on Jason during the months of captivity was organized around revelations, carefully constructed and carefully sequenced disclosures about Batman's nature, Batman's methods, Batman's relationship with Jason that the Joker had assembled from his extensive observation of both figures and that he deployed in the specific order most calculated to produce maximum psychological damage. He told Jason things that were partly true and partly distorted and entirely weaponized, about the degree to which Batman's mission consumed the people around it, about the specific ways in which Batman's commitment to an abstract justice made specific people, including the people closest to him, instrumentally valuable, rather than intrinsically so. Whether these revelations were accurate in their characterization of Batman is a question that the mythology leaves deliberately open, because the answer is complicated, and the complication is the point. What is unambiguously true is that they were delivered to someone who had been physically and psychologically depleted, to the point where the ordinary capacity for critical assessment of incoming information had been significantly reduced, and that they were delivered with the specific craft of someone who understood exactly how much truth needed to be present in a distortion for the distortion to be believed. By the time the crowbar arrived, Jason Todd, as a specific and coherent psychological entity, as the specific combination of experiences and commitments and relationships and beliefs that had constituted the particular person Batman had known, had already been substantially dismantled. The death that followed was not the beginning of his destruction, but its completion. And understanding this is essential to understanding what the pit's resurrection produced, because the pit restored the biological substrate of a person whose psychological organization had been subjected to an extended and sophisticated deconstruction before the restoration occurred. The circumstances by which Jason's body came into Ra's al Ghul's possession are documented with varying specificity across the mythology's various continuities, but the essential elements are consistent. Ra's al Ghul acquired Jason's remains during a period when his own plans required a disruption of Batman's operational effectiveness, and his assessment of what a resurrected Jason Todd would contribute to that disruption was the primary motivation for using the pit. The decision was not humanitarian. Ra's al Ghul did not resurrect Jason because the waste of a young person's life troubled him. The Lazarus madness's cumulative effects on his empathic architecture had made the waste of specific young lives something that his philosophy could accommodate without significant moral friction. He resurrected Jason because a resurrected Jason shaped by everything that had happened to him before his death, and by whatever the pit's restoration would do to his psychological organization in the aftermath of that history, was a useful instrument for a specific, strategic purpose. The resurrection was an act of deliberate cruelty toward Batman, the return of something Batman had lost, in a form that would cause a different and more sustained form of damage than the original loss had produced. Jason's immersion in the pit occurred under conditions that made his acute Lazarus madness among the most severe documented in the mythology's history, and the severity was not simply the product of the pit's standard disruption of ordinary psychological organization. It was the product of the pit's standard disruption interacting with a psychology that had been subjected to months of deliberate deconstruction, and that had then experienced the specific neurological and psychological disruption of violent death, producing a state that the standard recovery frameworks for Lazarus madness were not calibrated for. The acute phase was extreme, not simply the intense agitation and perceptual distortion that the standard madness presentation involves, but something that incorporated the specific contents of Jason's deconstructed psychology with a violence and a specificity that made the disclosure quality of the madness into something more like a detonation than a revelation. What the pit revealed was not the person Jason had been before the Joker's months of careful work on him. It revealed what those months had made of him, the specific configuration of rage and grief and betrayal and loss, and the particular quality of anger that belongs to someone who has been made to understand, through the most painful available means, that the protection they had trusted was insufficient to protect them. Talia al Ghul's role in the period following Jason's resurrection was the role of someone who understood what the pit had done and what its aftermath required, and who was capable of providing both the physical care and the specific quality of presence that the situation demanded, from a position of motivation that combined genuine compassion for someone who had been through an extraordinary ordeal with the strategic interests of her father's organization and the specific complexity of her own relationship with Batman that made Jason's existence a subject of interest that exceeded simple organizational utility. She was with Jason in the weeks and months following his immersion, with a consistency that the accounts establish as more than administrative oversight of a strategic asset, providing the sustained human presence that the post-madness recovery period requires, and that Ra's al Ghul's strategic framing of the resurrection had not explicitly included in the planning, but that Talia recognized as both necessary and something she was willing to provide. What Talia provided in this period was, in the deepest sense, a form of witness, the specific quality of sustained human attention that the recovery from an experience as extreme as Jason's required, the presence of someone who was capable of seeing him as a specific person with a specific history, rather than as a strategic asset or a vehicle for another person's plans. Whether this witnessing constituted the beginning of a relationship between them that had dimensions beyond the immediate context of his recovery is a question that the mythology handles with the ambiguity that belongs to relationships, that are genuinely complicated and that resist simple characterization. But what is clear across the accounts is that Talia's presence in Jason's recovery period was meaningful to the recovery in ways that went beyond the simple provision of physical care. The Red Hood identity that Jason eventually adopted, the specific choice of that name, the specific history that the name carried, and what carrying it communicated, was one of the most deliberately constructed symbolic acts in the DC Universe's mythology, and understanding it requires understanding both the name's history and the specific statement that reclaiming it made in the context of Jason's experience. The name Red Hood had been used before, most significantly by the figure who would become the Joker in the formative moment of his own transformation. The person who wore the red hood into the Ace Chemicals facility and came out the other side as something entirely different. Jason's adoption of this name was not accidental or ignorant of its history. It was a conscious reclamation, a deliberate act of taking back from the person who had defined it and defined Jason through the most extreme form of violation available to him, a name that would no longer belong to the Joker's story but to Jason's own, a name that transformed the symbol of one person's destruction into the emblem of another person's reconstruction from the ruins of what that destruction had left. The philosophical question that Jason's resurrection poses for the mythology, and that the mythology has engaged with across the various storylines that have developed his character following the resurrection, is the question of what came back. Whether the person who emerged from the pit and the recovery and the Red Hood construction was continuous with the person who went into the Joker's captivity and the warehouse is a question that does not have a clean answer, and that the mythology does not pretend to resolve cleanly. The memories are continuous, the skills are continuous, the biographical history is present and accessible and clearly operative in the choices and the relationships of the person who came back. But the psychological organization that had connected those memories and skills and history into a specific person had been subjected to the Joker's months of deliberate deconstruction and then to the pit's disruption. And what remained on the other side of both was not simply the original person with additional experience. It was someone whose relationship to everything the original person had been was genuine and acknowledged and clearly operative. The grief and the love and the sense of betrayal were all real and all connected to real history, but whose organization of that relationship was different in ways that mattered for who they were and how they acted. Batman's response to Jason's return is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in Batman's history, precisely because of what it reveals about the limits of Batman's formidable psychological defenses. He is capable of managing grief on a scale and with a thoroughness that most people could not maintain across the kind of extended engagement with loss that his career involves. He is capable of integrating the deaths of people he has cared about into a relationship with mortality that does not destabilize his operational effectiveness or his fundamental commitments. What he is less capable of managing, what the mythology of Jason's resurrection consistently returns to as the wound that did not heal in the ordinary way, is the specific form of confrontation that Jason's return represented. Not simply the grief of loss revisited, but the specific moral question that the returned Jason embodied, whether what had been done to him was Batman's fault in a sense that went beyond the obvious tactical failure of not arriving at the warehouse in time, whether the system of relationships that Batman had built around his mission was one that he was justified in building, given what it was capable of producing in the people it consumed. Jason's anger at Batman was not simply the displaced grief of someone who had been through an extreme ordeal and needed somewhere to put it. It was a genuine moral accusation, and the mythology grants it the dignity of genuine moral accusation rather than simply pathologizing it as trauma response. The specific things that Jason accused Batman of treating the people closest to him as instruments of a mission rather than as people whose welfare was an end in itself, of maintaining a moral framework that made certain kinds of violence prohibitions absolute in ways that produced outcomes more damaging than the prohibited violence would have produced, were not simply the distorted perceptions of a traumatized mind. They were observations, shaped and amplified and distorted by everything Jason had been through, but rooted in genuine observations about the specific ways in which Batman's mission and Batman's methods and Batman's relationship with the moral constraints he had established produced consequences that the person committed to those constraints could not prevent without abandoning the constraints. The conversation they could not quite have across the many encounters the mythology stages between them following Jason's return was a conversation about whether Batman should have killed the Joker. Jason's position was that the answer was yes, that the Joker's continued existence was not a principled achievement of Batman's commitment to non-lethal justice, but a catastrophic, ongoing moral failure whose costs were being paid by everyone the Joker subsequently damaged, and that the most honest accounting of those costs would acknowledge them as Batman's responsibility as surely as the Joker's. Batman's position was that the answer was no, that maintaining the commitment to not killing was the specific line whose crossing would make him into something other than what he was committed to being, that the identity of what he was depended on the maintenance of that specific limit, with the absoluteness that made it a limit rather than a preference. Neither position was simply wrong. The mythology understands this with the seriousness that the conversation deserves, and the irresolvability of the argument between them is not narrative failure, but narrative honesty about the genuine difficulty of the question Jason was asking. What the Lazarus Pit had given Jason in the resurrection that Ra's al Ghul intended as a strategic instrument and that Talia attended as something closer to genuine care was life, and the specific form of clarity that the madness occasionally produces in its aftermath, the capacity to see certain things without the filters that ordinary social accommodation imposes on perception, to say certain things that the filters would have moderated into something more manageable. Whether this clarity was the product of the pit's disruption or would have existed in some form regardless, whether it represented an authentic development of who Jason was, or a distortion produced by everything he had been through, whether it was something to be honored or something to be healed, these were questions that the mythology did not resolve, because they were questions that life, unlike mythology, does not resolve, and the mythology was being honest about that. Talia al Ghul was born into a position that the mythology had not invented a vocabulary for, because the specific combination of inheritance and capability and divided loyalty that her position involved did not correspond to any of the categories that the DC Universe's moral landscape normally used to organize its characters. She was not simply Ra's al Ghul's daughter, which would have made her comprehensible as an heir to a specific kind of villainy. She was not simply Batman's love interest, which would have made her comprehensible as a figure whose significance was primarily relational. She was not simply an independent operator pursuing her own agenda, which would have made her comprehensible as a character whose choices were primarily expressions of her own desires and assessments. She was all of these simultaneously, in configurations that changed across the decades of her appearances in the mythology, and that never stabilized into any one of them as the primary and organizing description. This refusal to stabilize is the most accurate thing about her, and the most important thing to understand about her, because the instability was not a failure of characterization, but the characterization, the specific form of the problem that her existence in the mythology was articulating. She was raised by Ra's al Ghul with an education whose ambition and comprehensiveness reflected both her father's centuries of accumulated knowledge and his specific intention that she be capable of inhabiting his world at its most demanding levels. She was trained in the same martial traditions that the League maintained, the same intellectual traditions that Ra's al Ghul's centuries of extended education had refined into something that exceeded any conventional curriculum, the same strategic and operational frameworks that the League's global activities required of its most capable members. She was, by any objective assessment of the relevant capabilities, one of the most formidably prepared individuals in the DC universe, a person whose training had produced not simply skill, but the specific integration of physical capability and intellectual sophistication and strategic vision that produced someone capable of operating effectively at the highest levels of the world that her father had built. She was also a person who had grown up knowing that her father would not die in the ordinary way, and that this fact had consequences for her own life, that the ordinary expectations of children about their relationship with their parents did not accommodate the expectation that a parent's life will eventually end, that the relationship will eventually reach a natural terminus, beyond which the child must navigate the world without the parent's specific gravity organizing the field around them. This expectation is one of the organizing features of how people develop their sense of their own autonomous existence, how they construct a self that is their own rather than simply a satellite of the parental identity. Talia grew up without the realistic expectation of this terminus. Her father's immortality meant that the field of his specific gravity would not relax in the ordinary way, that the development of her own autonomous existence would have to occur against the sustained resistance of a presence that normal mortality would eventually have removed from active competition with her autonomy. This structural fact about Talia's development growing up as the heir of someone who could not die and therefore could not truly pass anything on shaped her psychology in ways that the mythology has explored with varying degrees of explicit awareness, but that are consistently present in the patterns of her behavior and her choices. She was prepared to lead the League by a father who could not genuinely prepare to be replaced, because the genuine preparation for being replaced involves a relationship with one's own mortality that Ra's al Ghul's centuries of pit use had fundamentally altered. He prepared her as a successor the way an immortal prepares a successor, thoroughly in terms of capability and incompletely in terms of genuine transfer of authority, because the genuine transfer of authority requires the internal acceptance of one's own eventual absence that the pit had made psychologically impossible for Ra's al Ghul to fully achieve. Her relationship with the pit itself is one that the mythology has treated with less explicit detail than Ra's al Ghul's, which is appropriate to the character. Talia's relationship with the pit is less central to her identity than her father's, because she has not organized her entire extended existence around the pit's use in the way that Ra's al Ghul has. But the question of whether she has used the pit, and to what extent, and what its use has done to her psychology, is present in the mythology as an undertone that the explicit narrative rarely surfaces, but that the careful reader of the accumulated story detects in the specific ways that Talia navigates her divided loyalties and her own moral assessments. There is something in Talia that is harder than it should be, not in the way of someone who has simply been through difficult experiences, because difficult experiences produce specific forms of hardness that are legible in relationship to the specific experiences that produce them. In Talia, there is occasionally a hardness that is less legible in those terms, that corresponds more closely to the specific quality of psychological change that the Lazarus madness leaves behind than to the ordinary consequences of a difficult life. The specific nature of Talia's love for Batman is the element of her character that the mythology has examined most extensively and that has generated the most interpretive disagreement, partly because the specific nature is genuinely complicated, and partly because different creative teams across the decades of her appearances have emphasized different dimensions of the complication. What is consistent across the various accounts is that the feeling is genuine, is not simply instrumental in the way that a calculated seduction for strategic purposes would be instrumental, does not reduce to the category of political alliance dressed in romantic vocabulary. She genuinely loves him, and the genuineness is the source of most of the tragedy that her character contains, because it is the genuineness that makes the irreconcilability of her position with his something more than a strategic problem and less than a resolvable conflict. She loves a man whose most fundamental commitment is to the protection of the individual human beings, whose lives Ra's al Ghul's philosophy treats as acceptable costs in service of the species' long-term survival. She is devoted to a father whose most fundamental commitment requires that she eventually become capable of implementing that philosophy with the willingness to accept those costs that implementation requires. The space between these two commitments is the space in which Talia's entire existence is conducted, and it is not a space that any amount of intelligence or capability or genuine love can expand into something comfortable to inhabit, because the contradiction at its center is not the kind that intelligence or capability or love can resolve. It can only be navigated imperfectly, with the specific cost of imperfect navigation being paid in the currency of repeated betrayal of her father, when her love for Batman and her own moral assessments lead her to act against Ra's al Ghul's plans, and of Batman, when her devotion to her father and her commitment to the organization that her upbringing has made her identity lead her to act against Batman's. The betrayals in both directions are not evidence of bad faith, in the ordinary sense, are not evidence of someone who is primarily loyal to herself and who uses both relationships instrumentally while pretending to genuine commitment. They are evidence of genuine commitment to both relationships, maintained in a situation where genuine commitment to both is structurally impossible, and where the failure of any given attempt to serve both simultaneously produces a betrayal that is experienced as genuine by the person betrayed, because it is genuine because the commitment that produced the action was real, and the conflict between commitments that made the action unavoidable was real, and the pain of the betrayal on both sides was real. Talia betrays people she genuinely loves because the commitments that make her who she is are organized around contradictory centers, and the betrayals are not the failure of her love, but the expression of its impossibility. Damian Wayne is the most dramatic expression of the irreconcilability of Talia's position, the son, whose existence embodied in the most physical and most permanent possible way the intersection of the two worlds between which she was perpetually navigating. He carries Ra's al Ghul's bloodline and Batman's, which means he carries in his biology the specific contradiction that Talia's life had been organized around navigating, and the mythology's treatment of Damian's development across the various continuities in which he appears can be read as the mythology's sustained attempt to imagine what a person makes of an inheritance whose elements are in such fundamental tension. The question of Damian's relationship to the Lazarus Pit, whether he will use it, what using it would do to a psychology that already contains so much of both of the people, whose relationship with the pit has been most extensively examined, is one that the mythology leaves as an open question, whose openness is itself meaningful, suggesting that the trajectory of Damian's relationship with his dual inheritance has not been determined in the way that Ra's al Ghul's, or Jason's, or Talia's has been determined. The tragedy of Talia's position is, in its final formulation, the tragedy of someone who was given everything necessary to succeed in a world she did not fully choose, and not enough of what would have been necessary to navigate the distance between that world and the one she also loved. Ra's al Ghul prepared her with extraordinary thoroughness for the League's world, for its operational demands, its intellectual framework, its specific form of moral seriousness. He did not prepare her, because he could not prepare her, for the specific form of impossible navigation that her love for Batman made necessary, because the centuries of Lazarus madness had progressively eroded in him the empathic capacity that would have allowed him to fully see the impossibility of what he was asking her to inhabit. He loved her, genuinely, in the ways that his psychology still permitted. He did not fully understand what his immortality and his philosophy and the world he had built were doing to her, because the madness had taken from him the very faculty most necessary for that understanding. She was between two worlds for the entirety of the mythology's engagement with her, fully at home in neither, carrying the specific competence and the specific love and the specific damage of someone who had been prepared for an impossible position with extraordinary care and insufficient acknowledgement of its impossibility. The green water waited beneath her father's extended existence, patient as it had always been, indifferent to what it was costing the people who moved through the world it sustained. Talia moved through that world with the grace and the intelligence and the sorrow of someone who had been given no choice about the terms of her inheritance and had made the best available use of what those terms permitted, which was less than she deserved and more than the mythology sometimes recognized, and which was enough, in the most specific and irreducible sense, to constitute a life worth the chronicling. There is a particular organizational problem that immortality creates, which the standard frameworks for thinking about institutions and their longevity were not designed to address, because the standard frameworks assume that the person at the top of any organizational hierarchy will eventually be replaced, and that the organization's survival therefore depends on its capacity to manage succession in ways that preserve the institutional character while accommodating the change in individual leadership that succession necessarily involves. Every significant theory of organizational design, every practical tradition of institution building that the human world has developed across the full span of its civilizational history, has been built around the management of this succession problem as the central challenge of institutional continuity. Ra's al Ghul's League of Shadows faced a different problem, not the management of succession, but the management of an organization built around a leader who could not be succeeded, whose continued presence at the apex of the hierarchy was both the organization's greatest source of strength and its most significant structural anomaly. The feature that made the League unlike every other institution that the world's organizational traditions had developed frameworks for, and that required Ra's al Ghul to develop. Across the centuries of the League's existence, an organizational theory that had no precedent to draw on. The founding of the League was not accomplished in a single organizational moment, which is the way that the mythology's more compressed accounts of Ra's al Ghul's history sometimes present it, as if the decision to protect the pit's secret was followed immediately by the existence of a fully formed global organization capable of implementing that protection. The reality, reconstructed from the various accounts that the DC universe has preserved, was considerably more gradual and considerably more iterative, a process of organizational development across decades in which Ra's al Ghul refined his understanding of what the protection required through the specific failures of his early attempts to implement it with insufficient organizational infrastructure. He learned, through the specific forms of failure, that insufficient infrastructure produces what the protection of a secret of the pit's significance in a world of the medieval period's political complexity actually demanded. And what it demanded was not simply secrecy, but the full combination of capability and ideology and organizational structure that could sustain the secrecy against the full range of threats that a secret of this significance attracted. The capability dimension of the League's founding was the dimension that Ra's al Ghul's specific background made him best prepared to develop initially, because his training in the martial and intellectual traditions of the medieval Islamic world had given him not simply skills, but a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between capability and effectiveness that the most sophisticated military and intelligence traditions of his era had developed. He understood what made certain kinds of fighters more effective than others, what made certain kinds of intelligence gathering more reliable than others, what made certain kinds of operational security more durable than others. And he had the centuries of extended life ahead of him to refine these understandings through practice and to accumulate the resources that the implementation of the resulting frameworks required. The League's fighters were not simply skilled in the way that the best fighters of any era were skilled. They were trained to a level of capability that reflected Ra's al Ghul's understanding of what a generation of dedicated training under optimal conditions could produce in a physically talented individual, implemented with the patience of someone who had the time to wait for the results. The ideological dimension of the League's founding was the dimension that required the most sophisticated organizational thinking, because the sustainability of an organization across the lifespans of its individual members, across generations of members, each of whom needed to understand the organization's purpose as their own purpose, rather than simply as their employer's agenda, required an ideological framework sufficiently compelling and sufficiently comprehensive to constitute for its adherents a complete account of why the work mattered and what it was for. Ra's al Ghul had the advantage, in developing this ideology, of genuinely believing it himself, which meant that the ideology he communicated was not a constructed justification for organizational purposes, but an authentic expression of conclusions he had actually reached through genuine observation and genuine reasoning. The authenticity was detectable and was detected by the people he recruited, and the detection of authenticity in an ideological framework is one of the most reliable mechanisms for producing genuine commitment, rather than simply behavioral compliance. The specific content of the ideology that the League's founding generation received was simpler than the fully developed environmental philosophy that the DC universe knows Ra's al Ghul for. Because the environmental crisis, whose scale eventually drove the philosophy to its most extreme conclusions, was not yet visible at the scale that would make those conclusions seem necessary rather than monstrous. What the founding generation received was a commitment to the preservation of the natural order, combined with a clear-eyed understanding of the specific ways in which accumulated human power tended toward the destruction of the preservations, conditions that made human civilization possible, a commitment that could be understood as a form of genuine service to humanity's long-term interests, even by members who might have found the philosophy's later developments more difficult to embrace. The ideology evolved across the centuries as Ra's al Ghul's observations accumulated, and as the Lazarus Madness's cumulative effects on his empathic architecture progressively removed the internal constraints that had kept the most extreme conclusions from feeling necessary, and the League's ideological training evolved with it, so that the members of any given period were trained in a version of the ideology whose specific content reflected what Ra's al Ghul's psychology had arrived at by that point, rather than the full trajectory of the ideology's development from its founding form to its contemporary expression. The structural dimension of the League's organization reflected Ra's al Ghul's understanding of the specific failure modes that had destroyed every secret organization he had observed across his centuries of extended life. Secrecy, without redundancy, was vulnerable to the elimination of the individuals who held the secrets. Capability without ideology produced mercenary loyalty that dissolved when the organizational interests and the individual interests diverged. Ideology without structure produced movements that were passionate and undirectable, capable of dramatic action, but not of the sustained operational discipline that the long-term protection of a secret of the Pit's significance required. The League's structure addressed each of these failure modes through organizational features that Ra's al Ghul had refined across the specific experiences that his centuries of observation provided a cell structure that distributed knowledge and capability in ways that limited the damage any single penetration could produce. A training process that developed ideology alongside capability, so that the two were integrated in each member's psychological framework, rather than existing as separate motivations that could be played against each other. A hierarchy that distributed operational authority while concentrating strategic authority in a way that preserved the coherence of the long-term mission, while allowing the tactical flexibility that operational complexity required. The question of how the League managed the Pit as an organizational resource, who had access to it, under what circumstances, and what the management of that access revealed about Ra's al Ghul's understanding of his own organization and its members, is one of the most revealing aspects of the League's internal structure, because the Pit was simultaneously the League's most significant strategic asset and its most significant organizational vulnerability. An organization whose members knew about the Pit's existence and whose leader used it for personal immortality was an organization that faced a specific and ongoing challenge: maintaining the commitment of members who possessed the knowledge of a resource that could, if used on them, extend their own lives indefinitely, but who were not being offered that use as a standard benefit of organizational membership. The specific ways in which Ra's al Ghul managed this challenge, the selective extension of Pit access to certain members under certain circumstances, the organizational mythology surrounding the Pit that framed access as something other than a personal benefit and more like a continuation of service, the specific criteria that governed which members received which forms of access, reflect an organizational intelligence that had been refined across centuries of managing an inherently difficult situation with considerable sophistication. The global infrastructure that the League maintained across its centuries of operation. The network of training facilities and safe houses and operational assets distributed across the full geographic range of the League's activities was the physical expression of an organizational ambition that exceeded anything that the world's conventional, criminal, or political organizations had achieved in terms of sustained global reach across extended time. Most global organizations were global in the sense of having operations in multiple locations at a single point in time. The League was global in a different and more comprehensive sense. It had maintained operations across the same geographic range for centuries, building relationships and resources and local knowledge that could not be replicated by any organization that had not had the time to develop them, accumulating the specific kind of institutional knowledge that only persistence across time can produce. The League knew things about specific locations and specific political environments and specific operational challenges that organizations founded in any conventional human time frame could not know, because knowing those things required having been present across the full span of time during which the relevant history had occurred. The specific question of what happens to the League's internal culture across the periods between Ra's al Ghul's active, direct involvement in its operations is one that the mythology has explored with varying degrees of explicitness, but that is consistently present as an undertone in the accounts of how the organization operates. Ra's al Ghul's immortality means that he is always technically available to be actively involved, but the actual pattern of his involvement has varied considerably across the League's history. Periods of intensive direct management, alternating with periods in which the organizational culture and the deputy leadership structures he had established operated with considerable autonomy. During the periods of relative autonomy, the League's character has drifted in ways that reflect both the specific people who held the deputy leadership positions and the specific conditions of the historical moment. And Ra's al Ghul's periodic reassertions of direct control have been partly exercises in organizational course correction, bringing the accumulated drift of autonomous operation back into alignment with the designed long-term vision whose continuity his immortality provided, but whose maintenance required his active attention to preserve against the ordinary tendency of organizations to be shaped by their immediate circumstances rather than their founding purposes. The training that the League provided to its operatives was the organization's most significant product and its most distinctive institutional achievement, because the training produced people who were not simply skilled, but who were specifically and comprehensively prepared for the specific kind of work that the League's mission required. The physical training was extreme by any conventional standard, not simply martial arts training of the kind that the world's most demanding fighting traditions provided, but a comprehensive physical development program that addressed every dimension of physical capability with the systematic thoroughness that Ra's al Ghul's centuries of accumulated understanding of human physical potential had produced. The intellectual training was equally comprehensive. League operatives were educated in history, languages, operational planning, strategic analysis, and the specific ideological framework that gave the work its purpose to a level that exceeded what any conventional intelligence or military training program produced. The psychological training was the most distinctive element, because it addressed the specific psychological demands of the League's work in ways that conventional training programs did not have the capacity for sustained commitment to long-term objectives across the shorter term. Pressures that operational life generated, the specific psychological resilience that the League's dangerous work required, the integration of the ideological framework with the operational reality in a way that maintained motivational coherence across the full range of circumstances that League operations encountered. What the training produced was a specific kind of person not simply capable and committed in the generic ways that the most demanding institutional training programs produce their graduates, but specifically prepared for the League's specific world, in ways that made them in some respects more capable within that world, and in other respects less adaptable to the world outside it. The League's graduates were not the most versatile people. Their abilities and their intelligence would have allowed them to become, if those abilities and that intelligence had been developed in a different institutional context. They were the most specifically prepared people for the specific demands of the League's mission that Ra's al Ghul's centuries of refined understanding of those demands had been able to produce, and the specificity of that preparation was both its greatest strength and the clearest expression of what it meant to be an institution organized entirely around a single immortal's vision of what the work required. Beyond the central mythology of Ra's al Ghul and the figures most intimately connected to his extended existence, the Lazarus Pit has functioned across the DC Universe's history as a thematic resource whose specific combination of properties, the promise of restoration, the cost of the madness, the philosophical questions about identity that the restoration raises, has made it available for engagement across a much broader range of characters and storylines than the Al Ghul family mythology alone could accommodate. The Pit is not simply a feature of Batman's corner of the DC universe. It is an element of the broader cosmological and ethical landscape, whose implications extend wherever the DC universe finds itself, needing to engage with the questions that the Pit most directly poses. Nissa al Ghul, Ra's al Ghul's other daughter, whose history with the Pit is among the DC universe's most morally complex treatments of what the Pit makes possible as an instrument of control, represents the mythology's most direct examination of the Pit as something other than a gift, as something that can be weaponized, not simply in the sense of being used in conflict, but in the more intimate and more disturbing sense of being used as a mechanism of psychological torture against someone who is simultaneously its beneficiary and its victim. Nissa's history involves repeated Pit immersion, not the voluntary periodic immersion that Ra's al Ghul uses for rejuvenation, not the desperate single use that the mythology documents in cases of resurrection, but a sustained and deliberate pattern of immersion and the resulting madness that was used as a tool for breaking and remaking her psychological organization across a period of extended captivity. The specific horror of this use of the Pit is the horror of having the mechanism of your restoration be simultaneously the mechanism of your destruction, of being given life repeatedly as a component of a process designed to destroy the specific configuration of will and memory and selfhood that made the life worth having. That Nissa survived this with enough of herself intact to eventually operate as an independent actor with her own agenda and her own moral framework is one of the mythology's most powerful demonstrations of the specific form of human resilience that the worst uses of the Pit's power could not entirely eliminate. The artificial Pit experiments that appear across the DC universe's various continuities represent the mythology's sustained engagement with the question of what the Pit is at its fundamental level, whether its power is the product of specific chemical properties that can be replicated with sufficient knowledge, or whether it is connected to something that the chemical analysis cannot reach, and that the chemical replication therefore cannot reproduce. The general finding across these experiments, consistent enough to constitute something approaching a canonical position on the question, is that the chemical dimension of the Pit can be approximated to a degree sufficient to produce some of its biological effects, that a sufficiently sophisticated understanding of Pit chemistry can produce substances that heal, that rejuvenate in limited ways, that perhaps, in optimal circumstances, produce a form of restoration from recent death that resembles the natural Pit's resurrection effect. What the artificial versions cannot reliably produce is the full power of the natural Pit, at its most extreme applications, the reconstruction of subjects who have been dead for extended periods, the reversal of damage so severe that the biological systems responsible for the body's own reconstruction have been entirely eliminated. The natural Pits are connected to something that the artificial versions are not, and that something is not fully identified in any scientific framework that the DC Universe's characters have access to, which leaves the question of what the natural pits are ultimately drawing on in the same state of productive ambiguity that characterizes the best elements of the Lazarus mythology. The DC Universe's broader supernatural architecture provides a context for the pit's power that the purely chemical or biological frameworks cannot, situating the pit within a cosmological landscape in which specific locations on the physical Earth correspond to specific features of the metaphysical reality that underlies and interpenetrates the physical. The concept of ley lines, the traditional vocabulary for describing the pattern of enhanced mystical energy that certain geographic locations possess, appears in the mythology's more mystically oriented accounts as a framework for understanding why Lazarus pits form where they do and why the naturally occurring ones are more powerful than artificially created versions. The locations where pits naturally occur are, on this account, locations where the membrane between the physical world and whatever lies beyond it is thinner than elsewhere, where the energy that animates biological life is more concentrated and more accessible, where the processes of living and dying are conducted in closer proximity to whatever their ultimate source and destination might be. The pit, on this account, is not simply a chemical phenomenon that happens to have biological effects, but a physical expression of a metaphysical reality, a place where the world's fundamental animating energy has pooled in a form that physical chemistry can detect and partially characterize while remaining unable to fully account for. The connections between the Lazarus Pit and the DC Universe's other major sources of supernatural power, the various magical traditions, the cosmic entities, the dimensional forces that constitute the broader landscape of the DC Universe's metaphysical architecture, have been explored across various storylines with varying degrees of explicit development, producing a network of thematic and sometimes narrative connections that situates the pit within a much larger cosmological context than the Ghul mythology alone requires. The pit's power is not, in the deepest reading of the mythology, simply Ra's al Ghul's personal resource for maintaining his extended existence. It is an expression of something much larger, of the world's own relationship with life and death, and the specific forces that maintain the boundary between them, that Ra's al Ghul has found and accessed and used. Across his centuries of extended life, while never fully understanding what he was accessing, or what the sustained use of it was drawing from the larger system of which it was a part. The treatment of the Lazarus Pit across Batman's animated adaptations and live-action appearances reflects the choices that different creative contexts have made about which dimensions of the mythology to emphasize and which to condense or transform. The animated adaptations have generally maintained the pit's visual iconography, the green luminescence, the underground setting, the dramatic quality of the resurrection moment, while simplifying the philosophical complexity of the Lazarus madness and the cumulative psychological effects of extended pit use into forms more compatible with the storytelling constraints of their respective formats. The live-action adaptations have made more varied choices, with some treatments emphasizing the pit's connection to the supernatural and others attempting to ground it more firmly in biological or chemical plausibility, and with the treatment of Ra's al Ghul's immortality varying considerably across the different continuities these adaptations establish. What has been consistent across essentially all of these treatments is the recognition of the pit's thematic importance, its function as the mythology's most direct engagement with the questions about death and identity, and the cost of defeating death that the Al Ghul storyline has always been about, and whose importance transcends the specific narrative contexts in which different creative teams have chosen to explore them. The question of whether the Lazarus pits are finite resources, whether the repeated use of a specific pit site eventually depletes whatever it is that makes the pit effective, leaving behind a geological formation that has the chemical composition of a pit but no longer possesses its restorative power, is one that the mythology has engaged with most directly in storylines that have examined the consequences of sustained heavy use of specific pit sites, and in the broader questions about the long-term sustainability of Ra's al Ghul's immortality, that his increasing reliance on the pits across the centuries of his extended life raises. The general trajectory of these engagements suggests that depletion is possible, that the power of individual pit sites is not inexhaustible, and that Ra's al Ghul's long-term planning has always included awareness of the depletion risk and the development of strategies for managing it, including the identification and securing of new pit sites as existing ones showed signs of diminishing power. Whether the total supply of Lazarus Pit power available across all existing natural pit sites is sufficient to sustain Ra's al Ghul's immortality indefinitely is a question that the mythology leaves as a genuine uncertainty, contributing to the specific quality of urgency that occasionally characterizes Ra's al Ghul's relationship with the pits, the urgency of someone who controls a vital resource that is not inexhaustible and who therefore cannot simply assume that the resource will always be there when needed. The questions that the Lazarus Pit mythology poses at its philosophical core are questions that human civilization has been asking in various forms since the beginning of recorded thought. And the mythology's specific contribution is not the originality of the questions, but the particular configuration in which it poses them and the specific narrative context in which it explores their implications. The question of what death is for, of whether the finite duration of human life is a feature of existence that produces meaning, or simply a limitation that the right technology or the right magic should be expected to overcome, is a question that every philosophical and religious tradition has engaged with from its own specific perspective. And the Lazarus Pit mythology engages with it from a perspective that those traditions had not generally been required to inhabit. The perspective of someone who has actually defeated death, not hypothetically, not in a story whose protagonist eventually descends to the underworld and returns, but in a form that has persisted across centuries of genuine continued existence. Ra's al Ghul's answer to the question of what death is for is complicated by the specific circumstances of his relationship to death, by the fact that he has defeated it for himself while administering it to others on a pounding scale that requires him to have a philosophical position on its value that can coexist with both his personal immunity and his willingness to implement mass death as a political and ecological strategy. His stated position is that death is necessary for meaning, that the urgency and the specificity of human commitment is inseparable from the knowledge of finitude, that immortality, untransformed by the specific forms of care and attention that mortality forces on the people who are subject to it, produces not a richer form of human life, but a progressively emptier one. This position is not simply self-serving rationalization, though the self-serving dimension is present and the mythology does not fully conceal it. It is a genuine philosophical position that has been argued by serious thinkers across the full span of human intellectual history, and Ra's al Ghul's centuries of personal experience with extended life provide him with a form of evidence for it that no mortal philosopher has access to. He has watched what immortality does to a person from the inside, and what he has watched has not straightforwardly contradicted the position that finitude is necessary for the specific forms of human engagement that make life worth living. The contradiction between this position and his own continued use of the pit is the most significant unresolved tension in Ra's al Ghul's character, and the mythology's treatment of this tension is the most honest thing it does philosophically. He believes that death is necessary, and he defeats his own death because the work he has defined as his life's purpose requires a lifespan that mortality cannot accommodate. Whether this is wisdom or rationalization, whether the work genuinely requires immortality, or whether the belief that it does is itself one of the Lazarus madnesses, accumulated contributions to his psychology, is a list question that the mythology asks without providing a clean answer, because the question does not have a clean answer, and the mythology is being honest about that. What is clear is that the contradiction is present, and that Ra's al Ghul is aware of it, and that his awareness of it has not produced the resolution that genuine philosophical engagement with a genuine contradiction normally, eventually produces. Because the madness has progressively eroded the specific psychological capacity for holding a contradiction with sufficient discomfort to eventually force its resolution. The identity question that the Lazarus Pit poses, whether the person who emerges from the pit after death is the same person who entered it, is the mythology's most direct engagement with the classical philosophical problem of personal identity. The question of what makes a person at one time the same person as the person at another time, and what is preserved through various forms of change that allows the continuity of personal identity to be maintained across those changes. The standard philosophical treatments of this problem have generally identified one of three things as the carrier of personal identity across time: the continuity of the body, the continuity of memory, or the continuity of some more abstract property of psychological organization that includes, but is not reducible to memory. The Lazarus Pit tests each of these frameworks against the specific challenge of resurrection, against the case of a person whose body has died and been restored, whose memories appear to be continuous through the death and restoration, and whose psychological organization has been disrupted by the madness in ways that produce genuine discontinuity between the pre-death and post-restoration person. The bodily continuity framework fails most obviously in the pit case, because the restoration from death involves a discontinuity in biological function that the ordinary continuity of the living body does not involve. The body dies and is rebuilt rather than simply persisting through the change, which produces a situation in which the question of whether the restored body is the same body or a very similar one built from the same biological materials is not clearly answerable in terms that the continuity framework requires. The memory continuity framework fares better but not perfectly, because the memories are present and appear continuous, but the madness produces a disruption in their organization and their accessibility in the immediate post-restoration period that raises questions about whether the continuity of stored memories is sufficient for identity continuity without the continuity of the psychological processes that organize and access those memories in the ordinary course of a functioning self. The psychological organization framework is the most sophisticated of the three, and the one that the mythology most directly engages, because the specific nature of the Lazarus madness, its disruption of the ordinary psychological organization, and its leaving behind of changes that the recovery does not entirely clear, raises precisely the questions about psychological continuity that this framework requires answering for identity continuity to be established. Batman's refusal of the pit is, at its philosophical core, a position about the identity question, rather than simply a moral position about the acceptability of the means by which the pit achieves its effects. He refuses the pit not simply because using it would be wrong in some straightforward moral sense, but because he understands through his observation of Ra's al Ghul and his analysis of the Lazarus madness and his specific understanding of the relationship between the pit's biological restoration and its psychological disruption, that the person who would use the pit repeatedly would not remain the person he is committed to being. The commitment to justice that organizes his existence depends on specific psychological capacities, the capacity for empathy with specific victims, the capacity for moral reasoning that takes individual lives as irreducible rather than as acceptable costs, the capacity for the specific form of controlled anger that distinguishes justice from vengeance that the cumulative Lazarus madness has demonstrated. In Ra's al Ghul's case, it progressively erodes. Batman refuses the pit because he understands that accepting it would eventually mean losing the specific person whose continued existence is the only thing that makes the refusal meaningful. The refusal is not self-sacrifice in the usual sense. It is self-preservation of the specific self that makes the refusal the right thing to do. The mythology's consistent treatment of the pit as a gift and a price, simultaneously as something that gives biological restoration while taking psychological stability, that extends life while progressively eroding, the specific psychological architecture that makes extended life worth the extension, is the mythology's implicit position on the question of whether defeating death is possible, without simultaneously defeating something essential about the person death would have claimed. The consistent answer across the mythology's various explorations of this question is no, not as a matter of cosmic justice or narrative convenience, but as the expression of a genuine insight about the relationship between mortality and the specific forms of human engagement that mortality motivates, the urgency that finitude imposes, the specificity of commitment that the knowledge of ending makes possible, the particular quality of attention to individual people and individual moments that the awareness of their passing motivates. These are not simply compensations for mortality that immortality can maintain through other means. They are, the mythology suggests, dependent on mortality in ways that go deeper than the psychological adjustment to changed circumstances, dependent in ways that the pit's chemical restoration cannot preserve, because the chemistry of the restoration is precisely the mechanism through which the dependence is disrupted. What the Lazarus Pit gives, finally, is the same thing that it takes. It gives more time, and it takes from the time. It gives the specific quality that made the time worth wanting. It gives Ra's al Ghul centuries, and takes from those centuries the capacity for the specific forms of connection and care that make centuries of experience something other than accumulation. It gives Jason Todd his life back, and takes from the returned life the specific psychological stability that might have allowed the life to be rebuilt on its original foundations. It gives every person who uses it a version of what they sought from it, and charges for the version a price that the seeking did not anticipate, because the price is not legible from the outside of the experience that reveals it. You cannot understand what the pit costs until you are already paying it, and by the time you understand you are paying it, you have already paid enough that stopping would not return what the paying has taken. This is the mythology's deepest wisdom and its most consistently maintained insight, present in every significant treatment of the pit across the full span of the DC Universe's engagement with it. The green water is real, the restoration is real, the cost is real, and the cost compounds in the dark, in the sealed underground chambers where the pit has been burning since before the first person found it. Patient in the way of things that have no relationship with urgency, because urgency is a property of finite existence, and the pit's relationship with finite existence is the relationship of something that can end it and restart it, and end it again, and that has been doing so for long enough that the patience has become indistinguishable from the nature of the thing itself.